back to England and sold. The crossing from Africa to the Americas usually took 60 to 90 days, but some voyages took as long as 4 or even 6 months. Bad weather and sickness could turn any trip into a nightmare.
The cramped quarters of ships being packed in such a way that a slave will be between the legs of another slave and having to lie in the feces. The lack of air, the longer this trip takes, the more suffocating.
The surgeon, upon going between decks in the morning to examine the situation of the slaves, frequently finds several dead, and sometimes a dead and living Negro fastened by their irons together. When this is the case, they are brought upon the deck. The living Negro is disengaged and the dead one thrown overboard. Alexander Falconbridge, ship's surgeon.
There are no doubt people who went mad. Inability to communicate, decisions having to be made, and this person is suffering as yourself. Does one help? Does one simply try to make it the best that one can alone, not knowing where am I being taken? What is my fate? For weeks, months, depending what the point of origin was.
One day, 2 of my wearied countrymen who were chained together somehow made it through the nettings and jumped into the sea. Immediately, another quite dejected fellow also followed their example, and I believe many more would have very soon done the same if they had not been prevented by the ship's crew, who were instantly alarmed. Olaudah Equiano.
The idea, I think, was that the slave cannot be allowed to die by his own will and intention. He cannot be allowed to die voluntarily. If he's going to die, it must be at the hands of his captors, so that in that case he doesn't spread a dangerous example.
Monday, 11th December. By the favor of divine providence, made a timely discovery today that the slaves were forming a plot for insurrection. Surprised 2 of them attempting to get off their irons, and in their rooms found knives, stones, shot, etc., and a cold chisel. There appeared 8 principally concerned in protecting the mischief, and 4 boys in supplying them with the above instruments. Put the boys in irons, and slightly in the thumbscrews to urge them to a full confession. Captain John Newton.
We stood in arms, firing on the revolted slaves, of whom we killed some and wounded many. And many of the most mutinous leapt overboard and drowned themselves in the ocean with much resolution. James Barbow, English sailor, 1701.
Often did I think many of the inhabitants of the deep much happier than myself. Every circumstance I met with served only to render my state more painful and heighten my apprehensions and my opinion of the cruelty of whites. Olaudah Equiano.
The slavers, they knew at one level that these were human beings, because they were obviously clearly human beings. At the same time, they were objects of profit. And those two concepts couldn't obviously be really reconciled, and they never were reconciled. It was just, I think, that the humane, the sense of the humanity of these people was simply suppressed for the sake of gold. And the shocking thing is that human beings are able indefinitely to suppress the urgings of their common humanity and to deny it for the sake of making profits.
Is not the slave trade entirely a war with the heart of man? And surely that which is begun by breaking down the barriers of virtue involves in its continuance destruction to every principle and buries all sentiment in ruin. O lauda equiano.
The Middle Passage ended for Equiano on the island of Barbados, one of the most profitable colonies in the British Empire. On Barbados, it was calculated that it was cheaper to work slaves to death and replace them with new slaves than to treat them humanely. Within 3 years of arrival, 1 out of 3 slaves would die. The boy Equiano, judged too small to cut sugarcane, was shipped north to the mainland of British America. On the mainland, the plantation system of Barbados was admired and imitated, particularly on the Carolina coast.
South Carolina started as the colony of a colony. Barbados had become overpopulated with the younger sons of English merchants and with their slaves. And in both cases, they began to look around, cast around for new places. And within the first decade after South Carolina's initial settlement, there were just loads of immigrants from Barbados who brought with them slaves from Barbados, but more important than just bringing slaves, unlike Virginia, they brought a fully conceived idea of slavery.
On the shores of the Ashley River stands Middleton Place, home to one of Carolina's oldest families. Middleton family members were destined to become part of the Carolina elite. A governor, a congressman, a signer of the Declaration of Independence. The family had been among the first settlers arriving from Barbados in 1678, with a land grant in Goose Creek, just 14 miles north of Charleston, Carolina's slave trading center. By 1706, a second generation of Middletons had almost tripled the size of the family's land holdings to 5,000 acres of Carolina wilderness. At age 25, young Arthur Middleton was master of the Oaks plantation.
Dear Sarah, Mr. Arthur Middleton is married to my sister and was a schoolfellow with me when I was at Carolina. He is a sensible man and one of the richest in the country, with upwards of 100 Negroes. Thomas Amory.
Racial slavery turns out to be extraordinarily profitable for the people who have seized control. The planter can complain in his diary that it's been a bad year, or the crop is weak, or the rainy season lasted too long, but year in and year out, tremendous profits are being made.
The immigrants from Barbados had searched for a cash crop that would make them rich. Families like the Middletons found it. It was rice. The most prized Africans in Carolina were from Angola, Senegambia, and the Windward Coast, people who brought the rice-growing skills the Europeans did not have.
Rice is the most unhealthy work in which the slaves were employed, and they sank under it in great numbers. The causes of this dreadful mortality are the constant moisture and heat of the atmosphere, together with the alternate floodings and drying of the fields on which the Negroes are perpetually at work, often ankle-deep in mud, with their bare heads exposed to the fierce rays of the sun. Captain Basil Hall.
Many masters can't be persuaded that Negroes and Indians are otherwise than beasts, and use them like such. I daily perceive that many things are done here out of a worldly principle, little for God's sake. Francis Lejeune, Anglican minister.
In 1706, the Middletons donated 4 acres of land for a church in Goose Creek. Francis Lejeune, the first full-time Anglican minister, was not opposed to slavery, but he preached that all men, regardless of color, had immortal souls. He earned a reputation for spending time with the Negroes, baptizing and teaching them to read the Bible. He spoke out often against the brutality of Carolina slaveholders who were seeking to control the growing population of Africans.
I have had of late an opportunity to oppose with all my might a very unhumane law in relation to runaway Negroes. Such a Negro must be mutilated by amputation of testicles if it be a man, and an ear if a woman. I have openly declared against such a punishment, grounded upon the law of God. Francis Lejeune.
The Anglican missionaries probably described the black community better than anyone at the time in early Carolina. They described it as a nation within a nation. The Africans lived separated from the rest of society. Being freshly from Africa, their frame of reference was African. They were very much familiar with this kind of subtropical environment that they found themselves in Carolina. There's still communities of people who live, love, raise children, and work, and they feel that as people, as humans, they have a right to come and go. They have a right to visit their wives and their husbands on other plantations. It was, as one traveler said, a Negro country.
Their numbers increase every day, as well by birth as importation. And in case there should arise a man of desperate courage, exasperated by a desperate fortune, he might kindle a servile war. Such a man might be dreadfully mischievous before any opposition could be formed against him, and tinge our rivers as wide as they are with blood. William Byrd, Virginia planter.
In 1710, just 15 years after Rice took hold in Carolina, Africans began to outnumber Europeans in the colony. As the number of Africans rose, so too did white fear and retaliation.
Mr. D told me once he cut off a Negro man's leg for running away. I asked him if the man had died in the operation, and how he, as a Christian, could answer for the horrid act before God. And he told me answering was a thing of another world,